Of all the major powers that participated in World War II, Italy is perhaps the one with the worst reputation when it comes to armored warfare. The reputation is by no means unjustified, as despite having a vast array of opportunities to develop tank doctrines and training regimes that were at least competitive with those of other powers, the Regio Esercito continually demonstrated a stubborn unwillingness to modernize. This video will explore both reasons behind the regressive attitude and look at the many practical issues faced by the few Italian commanders who tried to wrestle with the system and give the soldiers a chance against a better equipped and motivated opponents. Before the outbreak of hostilities, the Italian war industry lagged behind its contemporaries in important aspects. What training schools the nation had would fill with obsolete vehicles or tiny turretless tanks such as the Carri Veloci 33 and 35. Medium tank crews had especially bad, with the Bologna tank school having to rely exclusively on the single Great War vintage Schneider CA until 1936. A major potential source of practical experience had been the Spanish Civil War, where Italian armed forces had squared off against Soviet-made tanks on several occasions. However, Italy's poor performance during these encounters were attributed primarily to the outdated nature of vehicles themselves, rather than the poor training of their operators. To compensate for this perceived weakness, the Autoblinda AB-40 and the M1139 tank were pushed into production. But the Regio Esercito made a very few attempts to actually integrate these new vehicles into their doctrine, which remained stubbornly fixated on defensive mountain warfare. In absolute fairness to the Italians, this was not a completely irrational move. Italy's success against Austria-Hungary during the Great War came primarily from its commitment to trench warfare in the high mountain passes of the Alps, and Italy itself was notoriously rugged and undeveloped part of Europe. Meanwhile, Benito Mussolini's territorial ambitions ranged from the mountainous wilderness of the Balkans to the scorching deserts of North Africa, neither of which were optimal terrain for tank deployment. Of course, none of these obstacles justified the half-hearted and lackluster approach of the Regio Esercito towards the training of its armored corps. Right from the start, Italian military schools failed to properly distinguish tank crews from either regular infantry or the older cavalry troops. Fast tanks and armored tanks were delivered to the Scuola Militare di Cavalleria in Pinerolo, Piemonte. This school drew recruits from soldiers with prior training as horse cavalry or from the famous Italian light assault infantry known as Bersaglieri. By contrast, medium tank crews were trained at newer and more specialized institutions. However, these latter crews were given the confusing designation of Fanteria Carista, indicating that the Regio Esercito still regarded them as infantry with extra duties, rather than proper vehicle drivers. Precise details on the Italian training regimes just before and during World War II are sparse, but circumstantial evidence indicates they were rushed, perfunctorily and inadequate at the best of times. In its war diary, the 8th Battaglione Bersaglieri Blindato Autonomo claimed that its crew training lasted from mid-August 1941 to October of the same year, before they were rushed straight to the North African front lines. If anything, 3 whole months of training was a luxury for Italian Armored Corps recruits. In December of 1941, the best Italian light tank of the war, the Carro Armato L640, was just entering service. Gunners for this new vehicle were allowed to fire a maximum of 42 rounds each from the 20mm main gun and 250 rounds from the Coxel 8mm machine gun. Drivers had to carefully ration their 8 tons of gasoline, while the logistical trucks were allotted only 1 ton of diesel. To top it all off, all 3 training squadrons were only allowed a few days of live fire exercises before they were shooed off to the front. The situation of the Italian medium tankers was scarcely any better. Production of the Carro Armato M1340 started in January 1940. Training courses were then hastily thrown together at the Corso Carista in the Centro Addestramento Caristi for a grand total of a dozen officers, a similar number of NCOs, and 30 infantrymen. Tank commanders were then haphazardly selected from infantrymen who had a driver's license and at least a vague knowledge of mechanics. The new crews then spent a large portion of their training time on the Carro Armato M1139 and the Carri Armati L335 tanks, before having to take turns on the single M1340 prototype available to them. Rather than receiving specialized training, each new member was trained to perform multiple tasks. Nearly all received training as radio operators, which turned out to be a complete waste of time when the first production models of the Carri Armati M1340 trundled into the school with no radios to speak of. And just like with the light tanks, the new medium tanks came with barely any ammunition for live fire exercises. Each tank commander had to make do with 5 rounds of 47mm and a single magazine for the machine gun, while the radio operator gunner was allowed to play with a pathetic 3 rounds of 47mm. Yet, somehow, the Italians managed to fall below even their own low standards, as by the 4th of February 1940, the demands of war were so great that the whole course was interrupted, and the 54 crew members dragged off to the front. A similar event occurred on the Ansaldo Fossati School of Genoa, which was able to give its trainees 19 whole days of instruction on a single Carro Armato M3040 and whatever vehicles were being tested on the Ansaldo factory after production. By early August, it became clear even to the Regio Esercito that their tank crews desperately needed better training. And so, on the 29th, courses restarted at the Bracciano Training School. A full battalion of students enrolled, who presumably then had to all draw straws to figure out who got priority on the 14 tanks they had available to train with. But, while they had enough students for a passable tank school, the Italians lacked instructors, as all their officers and NCOs were currently deployed in North Africa or the Balkans. Without men familiar in the field operation and quirks of the training vehicles, drivers were left ignorant of their true potential. Course materials also lacked important contextual details, such as how to conduct ambushes, scout different kinds of terrain, or overcome obstacles in the absence of infantry support. One of the only good pieces of advice given by the courses was the importance of stationary shooting, of particular value given the ongoing shortages of ammunition. By the end of 1941, training at the Bracciano school had progressed from being completely inadequate to merely substandard, mostly by the efforts of individual staff officers and inspectors with enough practical experience to handwrite course supplements in their spare time. Even so, it took until March of 1942 for the next logical step to occur, aka the formation of the Centri di Istruzione in North Africa. These centers were a vital development, as they were allowed tank crews to train directly in the environment they would spend their deployment in. Courses were still far too short overall, though, on average, drivers and gunners spent a mere 3 months familiarizing themselves with the complex machinery at their disposal, while engineers and maintenance staff were lucky to have a few days of practical training each. The level of neglect and apathy displayed by the Regio Esercito in this department was utterly inexcusable, and a source of tremendous frustration for the field commanders forced to deal with men who were baffled by even simple maintenance routines. In an effort to compensate for the complete lack of attention being paid to the technical side of tank training, the Fiat company diverted 120 staff from its factories and sent them to the various schools across the Italian mainland and major theaters of war. This project was entirely self-financed and began in June of 1940, lasting up until July of 1942. For most of the conflict, these 120 personnel worked hard to provide Italian crews with at least some level of technical expertise on the vehicles. Allied records indicate 19 of these personnel ended up as prisoners of war, while 3 died of various causes. By 1943, the Italian army had paid the price for its inadequate training regimes by being soundly defeated on all fronts, with the Kingdom of Italy being splintered into a zone controlled partially by the Allies in the south and a puppet state practically run by the Germans in the north. But many Italian fascists refused to disband with the Regio Esercito instead remaining loyal to dictator Benito Mussolini. In October 1943, Italian Defense Minister Marshal Rodolfo Graziani met Adolf Hitler in Germany to discuss the reorganization of the Italian army, using training facilities on German soil and staffed by German instructors. Eventually, 8 Italian infantry divisions and 1 armored division were put through courses under German instruction. Most of relevance to us was the Panzer Ausbildung Abteilung Süd, created at Montorio Veronese near Verona. The purpose of this unit was to train German soldiers to operate Italian captured vehicles and included 120 Italian officers, NCOs, and crew members as part of the first Compagnia Addestramento Italiana. After the war, 2 Italian veterans would write the book Come idealmente i caristi italiani, 1943-35, which recounted their experience of the training regime. As might be expected, the new German instructors were far superior to their former Italian counterparts in every way, and quickly set about training the 120 recruits in as many different necessary tasks as possible. Though the language barrier was a major initial obstacle, it was officially overcome by using Italian-speaking Germans from the Südtirol region of northern Italy, which remains a German ethnic majority to this day. Critically, a large part of the course focused on the engine maintenance, gun lubrication, and electrical wiring, finally giving Italian crews the technical knowledge needed to maintain their vehicles consistently. The book also details the rigorous schedule followed by the German instructors, with the Montorio Castle area being used to train crews on cooperative tactics and conduct shooting trials at concrete targets located at various distances. Courses lasted until June 1944, by which point the increasingly worsening war situation necessitated that the First Compagnia be disbanded and its members returned to regular duties. Though many of the 120 trainees were sent to units that could benefit from the new skills, at least some were sent where there were no armored vehicles at all, making their training pointless. In addition to German training schools, some loyalist units established their own ad hoc training programs during the last phase of the war. Largest of these were the Gruppo Corazzato Leonessa, made up from the remnants of several different units that had refused to disband and instead fled north with as many armored vehicles as they could lay their hands on. As its ranks swelled to include several veteran officers and many new recruits, the unit became known as the Distaccamento di Milano, and it was soon tasked with forming an official armored battalion to support the continued fascist war effort. The training of this new unit took place in the former barracks in a cavalry regiment, which included 2 enormous depots that were converted into a workshop and driving course. Lessons on engine maintenance, tank driving, shooting, and radio operation began immediately, ending with new recruits being awarded licenses for driving both tanks and armored cars. Since Milan was under a strict curfew at the time, drivers could use the deserted streets as training grounds for urban terrain. Even Allied bomber attacks were incorporated into the courses, with creative streets used as obstacle courses for off-road training sessions. Given the fairly static nature of combat in northern Italy, most of the trainees from the Milan detachment were assigned as garrison troops throughout the remainder of the Axis territory in the region. Some were used in anti-partisan operations, with surviving photographs of Leonessa members attesting that they were often loaned to other units to help with field training during the last desperate months of the war. In the final analysis, it is important to remember that while the Regio Esercito failed its armored units in almost every way imaginable, many of the issues they faced were generally insurmountable given the circumstance. Italy lacked the industrial capacity to build modern armored vehicles, meaning that whatever it did produce tended to be rushed to the front lines as soon as possible. Ammunition and fuel were also in short supply, with Italy having little noteworthy petrol production and the Germans sparing little for their Mediterranean allies. Italian staff officers were too entrenched in the old ways of warfare that had gotten them good results in the previous campaigns, but were completely inadequate on the modern battlefront. All of these factors combined into a truly egregious mess of an armored corps, substandard and always compared to its competition. However, this should not take away from the bravery and sense of duty of the Italian tankmen and tank officers who, despite having the cards heavily stacked against them by a capable adversary and an incompetent leadership, fought tenaciously with what they had. Thus concludes our look at Italian crew training during World War II. If you had been a prominent member of the Regio Esercito in 1939, what would you have done to improve things? Do you think the problems were insurmountable? Or was the incompetence the deciding factor in the outcome? Would you like us to look into the crew training regimes of any other nations? Let us know in the comments below. In addition, don't forget to check out our website for more articles just like this one. Until next time, keep us in your sights.